Thank you for attending online and in person. Sorry for being late. There's some traffic on the way here. I'm John Miller, one of the co-founders of the Philadelphia PowerShell user group. Tonight we are very happy to have self-proclaimed perpetual student Warren Frame. He actually gave a presentation entitled Continuous Deployment with PowerShell, a practical sysadmin-oriented walkthrough of the development side of the release pipeline. For those of you who don't know Warren, he is an infrastructure engineer with a penchant for PowerShell, science, cooking, information security, and family. Family, cookies, and the Oxford comma. We're going to have actually links to his GitHub site and his blog on our website, and also we'll put it in the announcement post and in the we're recording this as well, so we'll put it in the YouTube links also. With that, I'm actually going to hand it over to Warren and let him do any further introductions that he needs to do. Or anything else. So feel free to start presenting.
Cool. Thanks, John, and thanks for the invite. This is kind of exciting. Cool.
No, thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
Cool. All right. So thanks, everyone. I guess apologies ahead of time. I've never really done like a remote user group thing, so it might be kind of awkward. So hopefully it's not too bad. And if there is a baby in the background, apologies for that as well. Hopefully I'm kind of walled off a little bit, so you might not hear it. Anyways, so today I want to talk about continuous deployment for Microsoft sysadmins. This is a topic that comes up a lot, and you might think, as like if you're in the enterprise or a shop that's not really moving towards DevOps or that sort of way in the future, you might think that a lot of these tools don't necessarily apply to you. But I think it's really important to note that you can actually start using these today, even in a really traditional environment that's not actually moving in that direction yet. And we're going to be using psdeploy as an example module among a number of other tools. Before I get ahead of myself, I'm Warren Frame. I'm an infrastructure engineer at Harvard University's Research Computing Group under their Faculty of Arts and Sciences. A bit of a mouthful. Anyways, so I guess right before this job, I was sort of in more of an enterprise environment, working with like VMware vSphere, Citrix XenApp, Citrix NetScaler, System Center Operations Manager, and a lot of more enterprise products. But nowadays, I've moved a little more towards some of the fun things on sort of like the modern IT DevOps side of the house. But it's kind of nice because I get a perspective from both sides, so it's been very helpful. Occasionally, I write about and use PowerShell. If I learn something cool, I'll try to share it out there on Twitter. Wait. How do I do that? Nah, that's too much. And occasionally I'll blog out on ramblingcookiemonster.github.io. It's kind of few and far between because usually when I write on there, it's going to be associated with some kind of script or module or something that takes a little longer to write because I'm a bit slow. And a lot of people always ask, why are you calling yourself Cookie Monster? Long story short, I didn't actually come up with the name. My coworkers kind of noticed that I really liked cookies, and they gave me the email address and the nameplate Cookie Monster. So that's how that came about. In terms of an agenda, I wanted to kind of go through just really quickly some of the components in the so-called release pipeline, because to get to using psdeploy, generally you're going to have at least some of these pieces in place, and that's source control, testing, build systems, and then ultimately release. And then I guess just a quick note, this is really kind of, a lot of material is going to be either borrowed from like Michael Green, Stephen Morawski's white paper on the topic, or various other community contributions. And I'll include links to all of those in the slide notes that I can send your way after the demo. And finally, after we go through the background, we'll just do an actual demo. We'll walk through how to use this sort of in an open source environment using GitHub and AppVeyor that you could actually use, get started today without having to set up anything. And also do just a quick demo showing this pipeline using GitLab Community Edition, which actually includes a build server with it. And in both cases, we're going to be using Sake, Pesser, and psdeploy together. Although you can kind of substitute out components, you don't actually have to use those specific ones. So that's the agenda. All right, so lots of colors. Sorry about that. So basically, a release pipeline, if you're not familiar with the term or the components behind it, I figured the easiest way to illustrate this would just be to kind of show what you actually do. So long story short, when you're working on a release pipeline, you write some code. When you're done, you commit and push that to source control, and that's pretty much it. Everything else you've already set up behind the scenes. So you push to source control, your source control system tells your build system, hey, this project just got updated, and your build system is configured to run some set of tasks, which is usually going to include maybe some tests, and ideally a release. So it's actually, you don't have to worry about syncing up source with production. It just goes through that pipeline and everything happens automatically. And I included a few icons of some of the more popular solutions out there, and we'll talk about them a little bit as we go forward. There's a bunch of other solutions out there. These are just ones that I've either used or heard very good things about. So I think that's it for this slide. Let me double check. Yeah, okay. So we're basically just going to step through each of those components: source, build, test, and release. So on the source control side, source control is really just a way to manage changes to files. So for every change you have out there that you ever make or other people make, you're going to know who made the change, when they made it. Oh, can I turn on a laser pointer? Sorry, squirrel. Who made the change, when they made it, what specifically they changed. Like, so in this case, we can see that Sergey, a guy from Microsoft, on April 7th, oh my, this is a little too, on April 17th, made a change to two specific files. We see, it's not in the screenshot, but we can see he made a change to this tests file. We see the actual lines of code that he changed, and we see why. This kind of depends on the author to actually write a reasonable commit message, but we see that he's fixing pester tests for a particular module. And it seems kind of simplistic on the cover, but when you have all of that information stored in a repository that you can access, it really enables some awesome scenarios. So there's a whole bunch of different reasons that you might use it out there. If you could probably Google around for them. One of my favorites always is kind of like digging through. So I don't know about you, but occasionally I'll like rip out a piece of code and realize like a day or a week or minutes later that, hey, I actually kind of needed that. And if the change was long enough ago, I don't know when I actually changed it out. So Git is a source control solution that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Git actually lets you go in and say, hey, tell me all the points in time where I had a particular keyword somewhere in the code base, in the actual code or in the commit message, because maybe I remember I had like some specific variable name or a comment that I deleted. And it will let me go back and find that information. It's very helpful. It's very handy for maintaining multiple versions, comparing differences, and sharing it in collaboration. So that kind of brings me to a little tangent. If you go online or if you read about source control, a lot of times people will be like, hey, what source control thing should I use? And inevitably someone might answer, just use Git. They won't say like use GitHub or a solution that layers on top of Git, but just use vanilla Git. I really want to emphasize that it's very important to consider having sort of a central version control solution rather than just vanilla Git. There's a whole bunch of benefits from it. Having it as like a central source of truth that everyone knows that, hey, whatever's in this source control solution, that's the actual true version. It's not going to be like on Warren's desktop or on Joe's desktop. So that's kind of important. And it also enables a lot of the pipeline that we're going to talk about today. You can't really have random Git repositories out there that are integrated with a continuous integration system unless you're doing really ugly and difficult to discover things with normal Git hooks. It's much easier to just use a prepackaged solution like GitHub is really great. They have both there's like the hosted one that they'll host for you and the on-prem one that probably costs a little bit more. There's GitLab, which is really fantastic. We're using that today, the community edition. I'm a big fan of that. There's Visual Studio Team Services from Microsoft. I've heard good things about that. And there's GOGS, which is Go Git Service, which is just like it's probably one of the smaller and more efficient ways to just stand up a little wrapper on top of Git that lets you do pull requests in that whole workflow. And it runs on both Linux and Windows. So that's a pretty cool service for just really quickly getting started. So I think that's pretty much it. So if you take one thing away from today, I really want to emphasize that the stuff we're going to talk about today and many other things, you can't do them without source control. This is sort of like a building block that you need for a lot of other important processes and tools. So definitely consider using source control if you're not using it today. And we'll talk about the whole reason I wrote PS deploy was because I was kind of finding it a pain to use source control, and we'll talk about some ways you can get around using source control if you're not familiar with it or you're having difficulty keeping things in production up to date with things in your source control. So there's source control. That's like where you keep all your code and all the changes to your code are recorded. And then there's build systems, and really these are just they run things. They might run them on demand, like you click a button. They might run them on a schedule, like it's gonna like compile or build something every night, or by a trigger. So your source control, like your GitLab server, might send a webhook, which is just an HTTP request to your build server to trigger a build. And when I say the word build, it just means we're going to do one or more things. And it's usually associated with a repo. Sometimes it might not be. I'll include some links to it, but Matt Hodgkins wrote some really awesome stuff on using Jenkins, which is a popular build server out there, just as sort of like a GUI for PowerShell scripts. You basically set it up to run a particular PowerShell script. You can actually collect parameter input, and it will go and run stuff at the click of a button. So there's other uses for these tools, although their real purpose is continuous integration and deployment. It's important to note for all of these, they're all going to have different ways to sort of talk to them. They're going to have different syntax for their configuration files. So most of them, like GitLab and AppBear, use YAML. Here's some YAML from the PowerShell repository from Microsoft GitHub. And some of it's kind of, I'm not exactly sure. I think cache might be a way to like store stuff between multiple builds. But long story short, you see, hey, they're doing some install, they're importing a module, and then they have a section where they do a build, they do a test, and they finish. And I'm assuming that finish probably includes deployment. I don't know if they have that hooked up yet. But that's really all a build is, right? It's got some like background configuration information and then just steps for it to perform. And finally, definitely, you might have an option to define your build in a GUI, like Jenkins does this, and I don't know if Visual Studio Team Services has an alternative to this, but it's really important to have your builds defined in code because that way they're in source control. So if someone makes a change to the build scripts, that's still code. That's still something that's going to affect how things run. So it's kind of nice to have that in source control and actually alongside in your project so you can see the changes to your build as well. And let me double check to make sure I didn't have any notes. Nope, okay. So we've done source build. Any questions so far? Sorry, I'm kind of whipping through this too quickly.
No worries. No questions yet.
Cool. Okay. So you've made a change. You've pushed it to source control. Your source control system has told your build server, hey, Warren just made a change, or someone just made a change to me. Your build system is going to have a set of tasks for whatever change you just made that are always going to run. And so the next step, ideally, you're going to run some tests. So testing is very, very important. I used to think I think I wrote code reasonably well, and I'll notice if something breaks, so I don't really need to test. But I can't tell you how many times when I actually start adding tests, I discover maybe something's working, but it's not working because it's written right. It's working because maybe my computer's set up a certain way, or I just have this really bad logic that happens to work in a scenario that might change. So it's really cool to have tests. Don't be intimidated by the number of tests out there or different types of tests that you can perform out there. Even just getting started with really basic tests can be a huge help. So do consider running tests, and pester is really the way that you're going to run tests in PowerShell. I included just a fun little graphic over here. So unit testing is basically a way of saying, hey, is this little small piece of code working right? And a lot of times you have to kind of fake out PowerShell. So if you're testing a script that's going to, call Active Directory and make a change, you don't want your test to actually do that at the unit test level. You want to do something called mocking, where maybe your set AD user is mocked out to just return true, or just pretend like it succeeds. So you can get into a situation where your tests don't necessarily reflect a working set of code. So I thought that was kind of amusing. Anyways, so your unit test are just, is a small piece of code working right. Integration test is more like, are a couple unit tests or a couple components actually working together? Sometimes those might actually hit actual working systems. Sometimes they'll actually use mocking as well. So there's different ways you can do that. Excuse me. And then functional tests are kind of a way to say, for a particular user-facing feature, does that entire feature work? Regardless of how the code works under the covers, does that one particular feature work? So those are kind of a nice way to avoid rewriting your tests. So if you have a unit test or integration test out there and you're changing your code, you might have to rewrite those tests. When you have functional tests, they're going to be kind of like a black box. The test shouldn't care about how the actual code works under the covers. It should just care whether the feature is working as you intended. So those are kind of nice. And finally, moving towards modern IT practices, there's this thing called operational validation, where you've actually deployed a test system, an entire system, and that system's up and running, and you want to run tests to see if it's operating as you expected. I've seen examples out there where someone will spin up a DNS server, and you want to actually submit DNS queries and make sure that the records that you expect are in there. And there's a number of other interesting things there, and I'll include links to some handy articles out there. But yeah, so definitely consider writing tests. There's always sort of an argument when Michael Green and Stephen Murawski do their talks. They kind of sometimes banter about, should you do source control first or should you do tests first? I always lean towards source control first, because your tests should be in source control, and there's so many other things that are enabled by source control. So personally, I lean towards if you can't tackle all of these things at once, and who can really do that, you probably want to just tackle source control first, and then tests, definitely consider tackling that second. And I think that's it. And I'll include a number of links to some cool projects out there that use pester. There's a number of things out there, including something called PoSH spec, operational validation framework, and a number of other ones. And I'll just link to those because that's not really the topic for today. Okay, so rewinding, we've made a change. Our source control system tells our build system to run the build script, and our build script it runs some tests, hopefully, and if those tests pass, it's going to get to a release phase, right? So everything's working, now we're going to release. So I guess when we're talking about a release, we kind of have to say, well, what are we actually releasing? And that brings up the phrase build is kind of overloaded, so it might be kind of confusing. So when you talk about a build system, you're talking about Jenkins or Octopus or Jenkins or AppBear or a different system that's designed for builds. But there's also the word build in the sense that your build system is going to run a build script that might have a build phase. So in that sense, the build phase is it's something that produces an artifact, right? Maybe a PowerShell module, it packages it up and removes the test because you don't want to deploy those, maybe. Or maybe it compiles some source code because you're a developer doing really fancy things that I don't know how to do. There's all sorts of things that you might package up to deploy. Or maybe you're just, zipping up some files and shipping them off to a server. Whatever the case, you just have to know what you're going to release. If you hear people talking about continuous delivery and continuous deployment, the real differentiation there is deployment means you are deploying to production once things pass tests. Delivery just means everything that you run through could be deployed to production. So there's going to be some kind of manual step in there. Maybe it actually deploys to test, runs through everything, and then someone has to click a button to actually deploy it to production, or it has to be scheduled, or some other gate like that. Yep. So, and then there's a lot of, so there's sort of two major ways to deploy things. So there's tools like Octopus Deploy, and this is an example over here on the right. You can see that it's got some really specific and kind of powerful looking tasks, right? Like it will remove an existing, presumably a server from a load balancer. It will deploy that web server, warm it up, and add it back to the load balancer. So it will do these like sort of pre-canned steps. You don't actually have to know how to run the code behind that. So there's those pre-canned deployments, and then there's also just, you might write a script that runs a deployment. And so today we're going to be looking at PS deploy. That's kind of like a marriage of the two. It's basically a PowerShell module that kind of tries to can some deployment types. But it's not going to be nearly as nice looking as Octopus Deploy, but it's also free and written by someone who's not quite as competent as the people behind Octopus Deploy. Anyways, there's a lot of tools out there. So AppBear is pretty cool. It's probably the most popular continuous integration and deployment system out there for people who are using PowerShell. The PowerShell team uses it, and a whole bunch of community modules use it, whether they're just doing quick continuous integration tests or they're going the full, running some tests and actually deploying to the PowerShell gallery. It doesn't have as many deployment types. It's got like if you browse it, or actually there's a link in the notes that will show you the deployment types. I think it's like 10 or 11, nothing nearly as comprehensive as Octopus Deploy. There's also Visual Studio Team Services. So Microsoft has a good number of pre-canned deployment types, and you can actually extend that. So that's a pretty robust ecosystem. And there's Octopus Deploy, which is really just built for deployment. So I haven't actually used either of those or compared them, but I'm going to assume that Octopus Deploy might be a little more full-featured because that was really its intent. And finally, we're going to look at PS Deploy today. And let me run through, make sure I didn't miss anything. Release, yada, yada, yada. Okay, cool. And so when I have images like this, I include credits to like the website that I found it on. You can find that in the notes as well. Cool. So I keep mentioning PS Deploy. So what we're going to talk about today, it's just a PowerShell module, and this little graphic, it's using an older syntax for PS Deploy, but the gist of it is the same. You've got like maybe some scripts. So this is like an old module from an example from my last job where I had some PowerShell remoting endpoints to do some cool things with like constrained delegated endpoints, scheduled tasks, and then tests for those various files. So you've got like your source control. This is your project, and inside that project you have a little deployments YAML file that's going to say, hey, when you actually run this, I want you to deploy endpoints, and you see a little definition here saying the source is endpoints, and the destination is, this silly example, C:production location. So basically, it's a way for you to spell out, hey, when someone makes a change to source control, where should I put these things? And they end up being pushed out to this, in this example, just C production locations. And it's pretty straightforward. So again, this is old syntax. It's now invoke PS deploy, and we'll look at an example. But all you have to do is just run invoke PS deploy. It's pretty straightforward. A lot of people kind of asked, well, why wouldn't you just write the code in the build scripts? We all know how to write PowerShell. And for me, it's really important to use abstraction in PowerShell. So I've seen the same question for like invoke SQL CMD2. There'll be like scripts that have a whole bunch of like .NET code that's very difficult to read that could be boiled down to a single line of code that's pretty reasonably straightforward to read. So abstraction is really important. And so there's a number of sort of, pre-written like how to deploy to the gallery. That one's actually probably not needed because it's so simple, but it lets you at least group them together. AppBear module, that's a bunch of lines of code. If you look at some of the PowerShell team's repositories, they use this. That's where I borrowed the idea from. It's like 20 lines of code, and it basically lets you deploy a module that you can download not from the gallery, but from like a development locations if you want to test things before they actually release the gallery. Or to MKDocs, to Platypus, file system. There's all sorts of just sort of pre-canned deployment types, and you can extend it as well. So abstraction, definitely consider, if you're not doing it today, writing functions, modules, trying to abstract things out is definitely the way to go from my perspective. Readability is kind of helpful. So if you're quickly looking at a project and you want to know, hey, what actually is the outcome of this project? Just seeing a little deployments file, or in this case, it's going to be a psdeploy.ps1 file, is a really quick way to see, okay, well, that's what this project ultimately gives me. In terms of maintainability, if you have a number of different projects out there and you have a separate build script for every single one, and you happen to have a bug in that, or you find a better way to do something, now you have to go back and fix all of those different scripts. So by having these abstracted like individual scripts that handle everything, if you find a bug or a way to improve something, we can just fix those actual scripts rather than going across all of your builds and updating those. And finally, for portability. So this is just PowerShell. It will run pretty much anywhere PowerShell will. Jenkins, GitLab, AppVeyor, wherever you might be using it. And I think that's that. PS deploy. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. I think that is it. Yeah. So I'll have like a couple more super quick slides, but that's kind of the end of the slides. And I'm just going to run through kind of walking through PS deploy, some of the documentation out there. Any questions so far?
No, not this time.
Sweet. Okay. So how does can you guys read this?
Yeah, it looks good. Everyone looks good here? Yep.
A little bigger, I think. Yeah, that's good enough. Okay, so PS deploy, sure. Okay, so if you want to take a peek, it's out there. It's on GitHub, and I'll include the link to it, but it's GitHub Rumbling Cookie Monster PS deploy. It's got just a quick README, and in the README there is a link to some docs that are a little friendlier. And it's got like examples of how to use each of the sort of different deployment types. So a guy out there, Quellen, I don't recall his name, but anyways, a guy out there wrote something for deploying OVAs or OVF items on vSphere. So there's a bunch of different ways to deploy things. So I think he had some. I don't recall. Yeah, VCSA. Okay, so he deployed like VCSA, and I think he included a couple other sort of examples of how you could use this. So there's a couple different things that you could deploy, like file system. How do you deploy files? So most of that's pretty straightforward. It's out there in the docs, and I think that's all you would really need to see from there. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of run through how this works. I'll do it interactively, and then I'll do a quick demo of a build system, not really looking at PS deploy, but just like how does AppVeyor work, and then we'll do the example with GitLab. So to use PS deploy, it's really pretty straightforward. If you're using PowerShell 5 or you have the PowerShell Get module, you should be able to just run this. Otherwise, you'd have to, grab it from the repository, extract the particular folder, and load the module. But all the instructions are out in the repository. So you install the module, you import it, and it's probably already imported, but I'll just run it anyways. It's got a number of commands. They're going to look kind of funky because PS deploy is sort of it's written with a DSL. It's in how in Pester you you have your describe blocks, you're describing it, and your test should be something or other. So it's going to use similar language to Pester in the sense that it's going to kind of in English describe what it's doing. Unfortunately, from was reserved, so I couldn't use from. That got me really annoyed. Anyways, so that's that. There's a bunch of commands. You can run get help. There's an about file. You can run help for the command. We're going to skip that because that's not really helpful in a demo. So there's two main concepts with PS deploy. There's sort of the scripts that say what are you going to deploy, and there is the types, the scripts that say how do you deploy something. So to look at a definition of what are we going to deploy file, we can just open that up. So this is just a quick example using the file system type. So in this case, I'm just going to give it a name, an arbitrary name, example deployment. So I'm deploying example deployment. I'm going to use the file system type, and I don't need to name it, but I'm going to call it scripts, and I'm deploying that from this particular folder. It uses relative folders, but you could do hard folders if you knew it, the absolute path. I'm going to say I'm going to deploy it to this particular target. I'm going to tag this one dev because maybe I want to tag some things for prod and some things for dev, and maybe I want to make sure this modules one. And notice how it kind of requires you to combine these two things. So it's example deployment modules to get the actual name that you want to depend on. But anyway, so I want to run this module deployment first before I run this thing, and you'll see why in a moment. So this is another example. It's got very similar things, and you'll see this one has with options and mirror equals true. So if I ran like, I did not include that in the demo. Shoot. Never typed in a demo. PS deployments type. Sure. File system. So these are all scripts, so you would have to know where to get to them to get the help for them. So there's just a quick command, get PS deployment type. You point to a particular type you want to look at, and you can say show help, and that will just go and find the script and read the help from it. So this basically says how do you use the PS deployment type, and we'll run through and mirror. So mirror is if it's a folder, we're going to be calling the mirror option for robocopy, and it's important to know that because that can end up removing things. So that's actually why we're going to deploy this one first, because if we deployed it second, it would mirror and it would remove the scripts. Anyways, so that's just a quick example. There's a whole bunch of examples, and I'll do a quick rundown on like a module deployment later. But it's just an example for the file system, and that's it. So I can actually read that file. I can just run get PS deployment against it. And on the surface, it's going to tell us, what's the source, what's the target, what kind of deployment is it, does it have any options, that sort of thing. There's more like behind the scenes if you do select star. So in this case, we can see a little bit more. It runs a few tests, so this actually does exist, and it checks to see if it was a directory, so it knows to run robocopy versus copy item. Yeah, and if I had other options, so I could have specified dependencies. So over here, I see that this depends on that deployment up there. And it's also got prescript and postscript. So if you want to run a script before or after each of these, you could potentially do that. Yeah, so what the actual deployment script looks like, that file system one, these are all going to be different. Did it open? Yeah, depending on the thing that you're deploying. So in this case, it's file system. So apologies for the kind of ugly syntax here. I know you can do PS type name, but I kind of wrote this before I realized that. So basically, I take a deployment, and if you ever want to extend PS deploy, all you do is you just write a quick script that takes the deployment, and you just parse that. And it's got all of these properties. So you just write a script that can handle these sort of properties for those configuration files. So basically, it says, hey, is it a directory? If so, build up the arguments for robocopy, and actually invoke robocopy using a little wrapper function that someone wrote that turned out to be kind of handy. And if it's not a file, or if it's not a folder, it's going to be a file. So maybe we should check to see the hash, and if the hash matches, then we can actually skip it, and yada, yada, yada. I think there's, I think it does something to create a new directory if force is specified, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, so basically, this is just a quick example of how it deploys files. This probably needs a little work. We should probably support PowerShell core. So there might be some changes to how this works, and there might be multiple different file system deployment types depending on how you want to do it, rather than just assuming that you're going to want to run a robocopy for file or folders, copy item for files. But for now, that's how it works. Okay, so you've got your script that says, okay, these are my deployments that I want to run, and you've got your types that are like, okay, he's deploying a file system, so this is how you deploy it. Now we can just really quickly run it. So I'm going to browse to the path where that PS deploy thing is. So in a build system, in all the build systems that I've used, at least, you're basically dropped into the directory with your project. So we'll pretend like we're in a project in a build system, and we can test to see, hey, does the files that I want to deploy, do they exist? And we can run the deployments, and hopefully it actually works. Yeah, so we'll see like the robocopy output, and you could hide that if you wanted. So it went out, and it was supposed to deploy module first because we used mirror, even though in that deployment that was the second item because we had that dependency. This one deployed first, and after that the scripting ran, and it didn't use the mirror. So even though it knew that there's this extra thing, it didn't actually kill it. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So hopefully that means they're actually there. I can just read the directory and see, yeah, so the scripts are there and the module is there. And we'll kill that. Okay. So there are a variety of other deployment types. So one of the ones that I've found handy, and this isn't particularly helpful unless you're writing PowerShell modules, which I would really encourage you to do, or at least to contribute to them. If you've, oh geez, that's an aside, never mind. Sorry, I want to really encourage people to do it because the PowerShell gallery is kind of like, I think we're on like 1,000 or 1,100 modules out there versus like if you look at CPAN or the Python PyPy or Ruby Gems, we have like nowhere near as many modules as they do. So it would be really cool to sort of have our ecosystem build up a little bit. But anyways, so I want to take a quick look at, so PS Slack is a little project out there and it has 2 deployments in it. So basically, it's going to deploy a module, and it's really straightforward, right? So it's going to deploy using the PS Gallery module type and the source, and we'll talk about what this means, but the source is basically this directory for the module. We're going to use the PS Gallery as the place. So if you had an internal repository, you could substitute a URL for your like NuGet repository or something that's compatible with the PowerShell Gallery, and we're going to give it an API key. And that's that. So that's the really easy one. PS Gallery module really just, it runs publish module. The more complex one is the AppVeyor module. So the whole idea here is that if you want to sort of run a development, a module before it's ready for public release, like you want to test something out, see how it works, maybe Microsoft fixed a bug that you submitted and you want to just verify, that might not actually be in the production version yet, so you can go out to AppVeyor and you can actually pick it up. So to publish it, it's a bunch of lines of code. You have to package things up. It's not really friendly to do. So in this case, it's much nicer because we're just saying deploy this developer build by AppVeyor module. We give it that same source, and we can talk about that in a second. We're going to deploy that to AppVeyor, and you could specify. I think in this case it's really specific, so it's just to AppVeyor. I think this might actually be nonsense. I don't know if I actually do anything with that. And we give it a version, and that's going to use the AppVeyor build version. So what does that actually mean, right? What's all that nonsense mean? So I have the PowerShell Get module installed. So I'm going to register a repository out there, and I want to demo this. And Microsoft has a write-up on how to do this, and I'll include a link on how to do this, but. So if you know someone's writing these development builds, you just register the source, and that's pretty much it. Now I can actually search for a module in that repository, and ideally it will find it. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. So this is like the very latest build that has run for PS Slack, regardless of whether I actually publish it to the gallery. You might have noticed in here that there was a quick gate. So the gallery actually doesn't get deployed to unless I've added like an exclamation point deploy in the commit message, and it won't do it if it's not in the master branch, and it won't do it if it's like running on my computer. That's the build system there. Anyways, so that's just a quick example of deploying a module. Again, there's a bunch of different things that you could deploy. Those are just a few. Where am I going now? Let's see, demos, that's right. Way too many windows. Okay, so next up, we're going to take a quick look at a couple demos. So I want to just quickly walk through one of the more popular build systems out there. If you're contributing to open source, even if you're just like submitting issues and things, I think it's really important, and it's going to be more and more important. With Microsoft open sourcing PowerShell, I think that should hopefully help signal to larger enterprises that, yeah, open source actually is kind of nice, and you maybe shouldn't prevent your employees from benefiting from this. Not just your employees, but your entire business can benefit from this, right? Like, if you're writing scripts on your own and you're not getting the eyes from other people in the open source community, you might miss a bug, or you might duplicate work that someone's already written a module out there for. So definitely do consider that. Anyway, so enough rambling. Sorry about that. Source control. So I'll just quickly show you kind of the different steps for a particular a demo out there. So we're going to look at this AppFair example. How do I do this? So this is just a repository out there on GitHub. It's got the AppFair YAML file that's going to tell AppFair what to do. So I can look at that, and we're going to see, okay, I included some demo stuff, basically a variable that I might want to access. And AppFair has this way to sort of encrypt a variable so that only your account can decrypt it and see that value. And in this case, it's called some password. This isn't really important, but they have this concept of an image, or basically like it's an OS and some packages on it. So I'm just picking the default, which is Visual Studio 2015. And there's not many out there, but there's a list of them there. I can skip commits if I'm just updating a README, and that thing is just necessary for something we don't really care about. And so most of the time when I run a build and when I see other people run a build, I personally think it can be helpful to have things abstracted out into a script, because all these different build systems have their own way of defining things, and I think it can be a little more helpful by having it in an actual PowerShell script that might be a little more readable to someone who's not like an expert with AppFair or with GitLab or with these different tools. So in this case, it's just calling a build PS1 file, which we can look at. And in here, you guys might not be able to see this. I think I actually opened this already in anticipation here. Anyways, so in that build script, I'm going to do some really basic stuff. I'm going to make sure that I have NuGet so that I can install modules. I'm going to pull down something called build helpers. Those variables that I deployed to before, I'll show you in a second, but basically they're created using this module. And I'm going to set up my build environment, which basically creates some environment variables that are sort of deterministic, like whether you're on AppFair or Jenkins on your own local desktop. And I think someone added Visual Studio Team Services. I don't recall. But basically, this looks at the environment variables that those different tools create, and it sort of normalizes them so that you don't have to have like a build system specific scripts. You can kind of make it more general. And so in the script, all I'm doing is I'm looking at some general purpose things, right? Like what PowerShell version am I on? Look at some of the build helpers variables so we can take a peek at what that actually does. What modules are on the system, tell me the version and the path. Look at the environment variables, look at the PowerShell module path. So I actually included this because when you're writing these builds, it can be kind of a pain because it's not running on your computer. So debugging it can be kind of a little bit of a pain. So it can help to have a little script like this. And if you run into trouble with your build, you might add some of this verbose output to sort of see what's going on in your script, like what variables are out there and so forth. So anyways, I have this build script, and once I hit commits, all it did was it ran that script on AppFair. So I didn't mention this before with the build systems, but there's a number of different ways that build systems can work. So with tools like AppFair, Travis, and some other ones, they'll actually stand up, in most cases, they'll stand up VMs for you and run them on like a clean VM. They'll run your build on a clean VM. You don't have to worry about standing up that VM. You don't have to worry about anything. It does it for you. I think Visual Studio Team Services can do it as well. In other cases, you might actually have to stand up your own VM and create a little service on that VM that the build system can talk to. And so like GitLab, for example, uses that, where I had to install a runner on a Windows server out there. Or you might have a pool of servers that have these runners installed on them. So there's two ways to do it. AppFair just creates the VM for us. So this is running out there on the VM. Sorry about that aside. I'm all over the place. We looked at our build config, that YAML file. We looked at our build PS1. And we can look at the actual output of that build PS1. So all those different variables. So we're on PowerShell 5. We can see that this was actually kind of handy because AppFair on one of their images updated to PowerShell 5.1, and it broke a few things that I might have been relying on. Build helpers. So in this case, we see it told us, what's the project path, what's the commit message. It knows that we're in AppFair versus other build systems. It tells us we're in the master branch, and we're just on build 4. And depending on when you run this, where you run this, what your project looks like, there might be more of these available. We can quickly see, that there's a good number of modules out there on this server. and their paths and versions. We see, again, these environment variables. So if you remember, we made like that encrypted thing where we couldn't see the value of it. It was this weird encrypted text. I think it was some password. So in this case, we see that it actually decrypted it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you end up using a build system and you use whatever encryption tool that they use, just beware of verbose output, because that could show up in your build if your build outputs data like this. I might have seen that in the past. Yada, yada, yada. So the PS module path. So this can come in handy for troubleshooting, maybe a module from one of these paths is loading, you're not expecting it. Paths, so you see there's actually a lot of tools installed on these AppVeyor VMs. It's got Perl. Oh, yay, that's fun. NUnit. Yeah, so Python. Oh, geez, it's got Python 2.7. Oh, that's no fun. Okay, so there's a lot of different things installed on this AppVeyor VM, and I think that's really all I wanted to show you. So in this case, I made a change to this repository. I committed that change. In fact, we can actually look at that commit. Where are we? Code, commits. So we see change output to host fixed spelling, and if I go back here, we see that that's actually the build that ran, and so if you were looking at it in real time, you'd actually see the scroll by as it worked. So that's like the super simple example of how AppVeyor works. And so if you think about it, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with that, right? This is just kicking off a script. So you could do anything from deploying files to running tests to decommissioning and commissioning an entire service and all the servers that are included in it. It's really up to you what you want to do in there. So that is that. Now let's take a peek at an actual internal. So a lot of companies, maybe they're not comfortable having everything on GitHub yet, and even like open source companies, they're gonna keep some stuff private. So in this case, we're using GitLab. It's a really great product out there. Community Edition is free, and they're very generous in terms of what features they enable for the Community Edition. And on top of that, it actually includes its own build server. So in a lot of cases, we can go back here, take a look at the builds. So GitLab and Visual Studio Team Services are kind of nice because they're all one product. Like you've got your source control in Visual Studio Team Services and your build. So you don't have to worry about hooking those up. It just does it for you. Same deal with GitLab. AppVeyor actually makes it very nice because you just authenticate with GitHub and it sets up everything behind the scenes. But tools out there like Jenkins, which are really powerful and that you do really fantastic things, they're a little bit more of a pain to set up because you actually have to tell your source control system to set up some hooks. So if you look at your repository out here, you can actually go to settings and webhooks. And I can see that AppVeyor, actually, it did it for me. I didn't have to go in here and add this. So every time this project gets a commit or a pull request or a push, it will send a notification to this address. We just don't see that because AppVeyor did it for us. And then AppVeyor, on the Jenkins side or the AppVeyor side, there's magic that it has to do to kind of associate that webhook with a particular job or build. Yeah, anyways, sorry about that sidetrack. So that's one of the reasons I like GitLab, because it's all in the box. You don't really have to worry about hooking those different systems up. Makes it very straightforward. And what were we going to look at? So we'll look at the source, the build, the config, and the script. Okay. Where am I? So in this case, it's not an AppVeyor YAML, it's a GitLab YAML, and it's got its own like naming syntax. So you open that YAML file, and I made a really simple thing that you don't even need that CHs, I don't think, but I'm basically saying run a script, and I want to run it on runners or systems that have that agent running that are tagged with Windows. So this is a really simple. You can create a more complex build configuration, but this is just a simple one for illustration purposes. So that's running the build PS1 file, and in here, I have, so I'm actually going to do a demo where I deploy a file. So I clean things up so we know that we're not looking at a previous run's success. I do what I did in the previous thing where I grab NuGet, I install a few modules. I want build helpers, I want PS deploy, and I want pester. I install those modules and import them, and there's cleaner ways to do this. I just did it really quickly for this demo. And I run set build environment to create those BH variables that we can rely on. I'll actually spit out that information in the build so we can read it. We run our pester tests, and of course now the GitLab syntax is going to get thrown off. We run our pester tests, and if they fail, we have to explicitly throw an error. Some build systems like AppFair is actually pretty reasonable with it, but GitLab, and I've seen a few other ones, you do have to actually throw an error if something happens, or else it will just keep running. And we don't want that. We want to actually fail if our tests fail. We don't want to run a deployment. So once those tests run through, if they're successful and we don't have that error, we run invoke ps deploy, and that's it. And then finally, you wouldn't. No, well, actually, you might want to test a deployment after you run it. But in this case, we're just going to say, hey, did this deployment actually deploy files to this path? And this is like the same sort of deployment that we had before. You know, if we're in AppFair or any other known build system, GitLab in this case, you can run the build. Unknown is just like if you're on your own computer and it doesn't see any of the like AppFair or GitLab or Jenkins environment variables out there. It's only going to run on the master branch, and it's only going to run if we hit deploy. And it's just deploying, you know, files from the project path / product name to this path, and we give some verbose output if we didn't meet this criteria. Okay, so that's really straightforward. So if I actually go to the pipelines, I can actually see some of the examples that I might have had there before. I was having some fun with this. So failed. So we can actually see it run. It's not quite as pretty as AppFair. I think there's still a bug out there for showing color of Windows output, so you're not going to see the friendly pester colors. It's going to be a little more plain, unfortunately. But anyway, so we can see, yep, we've got these BH variables, so we can see we're in the master branch. We're using GitLab CI. We have the commit message, and that's that. So in this case, it's actually cutting it out, but there's a fail, an exclamation point fail here, and I'm failing tests if I see that. So it should pass if I don't fail it, and it's going to say, hey, no, this commit message that includes this fail right here doesn't pass because it shouldn't match fail, but it actually does. Anyways, it's just a convoluted test that I did to actually trigger a failure. So that's it. It failed the test. It errors out because pester test failed, and nothing gets deployed. Now, if I didn't include that, or if I didn't have any failing tests, it will hopefully deploy successfully. So in this case, again, I included a little exclamation point deploy, so I want to actually run that deployment. It's going to pass the pester tests. They're not colored. It's a little frustrating, but I can deal with it. We see the robocopy output, and finally, at the very end, we had the output where we looked at the deployed files, and we see that, yes, it actually deployed the GitLab example file. So using PS deploy or these various tools, you can really kind of substitute them out and use them anywhere. So I use it in GitLab here. I've used them in Jenkins. I know folks have used them in Visual Studio Team Services. So you can definitely use these in different products. Don't think that you have to use, maybe you're using Visual Studio Team Services. You don't necessarily have to use the built-in Visual Studio Team Services things. You can actually use community projects if you'd like, or you could use the fancy built-in stuff. So it's really up to what makes sense for your situation. So that's the second demo. It ran through the source build. Yep. Next step. So that's almost it. Now I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of examples, or well, maybe we'll just pick like one or two. There's a bunch of people out there who are using PS Deploy to automatically publish to the gallery, but there's some other fun ones like Brandon Paget has a couple that do a little more. So we can actually look at his build. So he's actually running Platypus to build up some help files. So I think he might do this locally on his file system before he commits, and then he pushes to the gallery. And he's using like, he's actually tagging it PS Gallery, and he's not tagging these PS Gallery. So he's got an interesting system set up where he's actually using multiple deployment types for his project. And there's some other interesting ones out there. Let's see, what else? I think that might be it. So there's a lot out there. If you are writing PowerShell modules, it's really pretty straightforward to get hooked up. There are some links that are in the notes on how you can hook up a module up to automatically deploy to these things. But if you're just writing scripts, configuration files at work, it can also be really helpful. Just I can't tell you how many times before I started using this, I would make a change in source control, but forget to push it out to production. Or, maybe I would just be like, oh, I'll do it later. In other cases, and you're really not supposed to do this, but in other cases, maybe I would make a change directly in production because I was fighting a fire. I didn't have time to deal with it to kind of sync up source control in production. And you really should never do this, but I've done it in the past. And so now my production environment is ahead of my source control, and hopefully I go back and remember. And I've had a third situation where I do both of those, and I have source control that's ahead in one spot, production's ahead in another spot. It's really, really messy, but if you just have a source control system out there, a simple build environment, it's really, really helpful. Even if you're just deploying scheduled tasks, configuration files, maybe internal PowerShell scripts or modules, it can be really beneficial. It's really not just for like infrastructure as code or other sort of modern IT solutions. It can be really beneficial just with an enterprise that's got some scripts and other things that might not be as complex as infrastructure as code. Anyways, yeah, so there's a whole bunch of projects out there, and I'm going to be updating these notes before I send them to you guys. But we looked at Pester, PS Deploy, and a number of other ones, and I think I include a whole bunch in here. Build helpers, yeah, Sake. Where's that? Oh, and OVF. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different projects out there, and I'll include links. I didn't actually get to make a complete list, unfortunately. There's some really great community modules out there, so it's worth taking a look at all of those. And Michael Green's presentations on the release pipeline model is also a great resource if you want to dive in a little deeper into how you can use, source, build, test, and release for entire services or components of services. And geez, I talked way too fast. I think that might be it. Let me double check. Where am I? So this is done. Yeah, oh my gosh. I talked way too fast. I'm sorry, guys. So any questions?
Any questions? No questions in person. Looks like anyone online have any questions? Doesn't look like that's the case. No, looks like no questions.
Sweet. So again, so if you have any takeaways, I'd really just recommend taking a look at source control. There's a lot of great options out there. Oh, I didn't even talk about what the icons look like. But anyways, if you're comfortable, you could do something that's out in the cloud, even if it's private. If you want something on-prem, I'd really recommend GitLab CE. Or GOGS if you want something super simple, but GitLab CE, it's just really straightforward, tons of features. It's a really fantastic solution. So definitely consider source control and start writing tests, even if they're really basic tests, that don't really do anything. Oh, haha. Okay, I knew I forgot something. Oh, sorry about that, guys. I have been quite disjointed today. Might not have gotten as much sleep as I needed. So tests, we were looking at that GitLab example, and we didn't actually look at the tests that we're running. So I included a super quick example in that GitLab project that included mocking, and there's a lot more that you can do. But this is just an example to know, you might wonder, how am I supposed to test a script if it's, actually making changes to Active Directory or vSphere or these different solutions out there? So in this case, I was testing the actual script is running send. Oh, geez, I didn't even include the script. Oh, I'm a terrible presenter. Okay, so the actual thing that this was testing was a GitLab example script, and it installed a module that we probably don't want to do when we're testing, and it's because we're going to assume that that should work because it's just a simple command. If we're doing unit tests, that is, and it runs a new Slack message and sends a message to Slack. So when you're doing a unit test, you don't want to actually send a message to Slack. You don't want to actually install that module. You just want to see, if the right things run. So in the actual test, we can mock these things and basically say, hey, if the user runs install module, don't actually run install module. Just don't return anything. It will just go through and pretend like it's succeeded. Same deal with send Slack message, except in this case, we actually define sort of like a definition for send Slack message. So in this case, we're just outputting a sense string. And in the test, so I run that script. And so in that script, instead of doing install module, it just, kind of skips by it, but it keeps track of it. So I can say, oh, I didn't run the test, but I could do assert mock called and make sure that that actually ran. Same deal with send Slack message. So if ultimately you want to make sure like some command that makes a change ran, you mock that command and you just make sure that it ran. Maybe you want to make sure it ran only one time. And you can also like record the output. This might be overkill, but you record the output and say, okay, did it actually generate the output from the mock? In case like it could have run in a different spot with different output. And then this was just the message that I used to trigger a fail if the commit had a fail. And that's pretty much it. Sorry about that. So if you're doing tests, mocking is a little more advanced. I think I started more with functional tests that actually made changes, and I was more testing scripts that were sort of like read-only scripts. But it's definitely worth getting into testing. It might seem complex at first, but as you start using it, I think it's kind of like PowerShell. You just have to start using it, and you'll pick it up pretty quickly. So that last-minute tangent, sorry about that. I think that is pretty much it on my end. Sorry, guys. That was way too quick.
No, not at all, Warren. Really appreciate it. Cool. So once again, I want to thank Warren for presenting. We're probably do some discussions on site, so feel free to stay online. Warren, if you want to hang out, you can. Otherwise, feel free to kick out. And then we'll obviously inform you once the recording's done and all the other fun stuff.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys. It was really fun. And if you want to catch up, hit me up on Slack. Go to slack.poshcode.org or just Google PowerShell Slack. There's a lot of PowerShell team members and other people in the PowerShell community there, so that's a really great way to get in touch with people. So anyways, I'll be there, and have a good night, guys.
Awesome. Thanks. Cool. Does anyone have anything they want to discuss or talk about before I get into just various errata? So this is when they just go over just PowerShell news stuff. Nothing too crazy actually. Let's see. DerbyCon, I think it was a week or two ago. A week or two. There's a bunch of PowerShell related stuff. Was there? It was on the PowerShell blog. We haven't seen it. I'd definitely check out if you're interested in anything security wise. One thing in particular that was interesting was, let's see if I can find it here. One of Carlos Perez actually spoke for us, it was like 6 months ago. Huge in the security community and penetration testing, and he did a presentation there, Thinking Purple, basically about how going, re-looking at the red versus blue like defense and penetration testing kind of dynamic. He's a huge contributor to PowerShell Empire, which is a post breach framework and kit and everything. So basically, it's ability to run all sorts of tools, well-known hacker tools like Metasploit, Mimikatz, and a bunch of other stuff after post breach using PowerShell, and being able to do a lot of this stuff without actually having access to PowerShell.exe. Basically, just running all the PowerShell stuff directly on top of .NET, which is really, really interesting for anyone who's actually curious about that sort of stuff. But there's a bunch of great other ones in here as well. Yeah, so actually someone else did a discussion on the Empire kit. But there's a bunch of really cool stuff here. I was looking over it, I was like, cool, this is some of the stuff I want to sit down and actually kind of review once I get a free moment. So definitely check that out. Let's see what else did I have here that was interesting. Another thing, the PowerShell team put PowerShell Get on GitHub. It's going to be the official place where you actually get it. So it's kind of interesting. It's another step in the way of them putting pretty much everything they have on open source, which is kind of cool. And also, they started this week was Regex Crash Course. I don't know about you guys, but it took me, I barely know Regex, but Regex is one of those things where it's like you'll struggle with it for years. I think one of the best explanations I've heard of it is like it looks like a spell that can just pull words out of text, pretty much, because you never know exactly what it's doing. But they're doing a pretty good crash course coming on here, and even I learned something pretty cool earlier in this week from it. So you can bring it up. They had it here that I didn't know I could do. This I thought was amazing because I do this all the time and constantly screw this up. But you can actually, if you have something and you want to escape any of the regex characters in there, you just do regex ; escape and put it in there, and it'll actually escape all the stuff that you would normally need to escape via regex, which I thought was awesome because I was like, I've done this multiple times and messed this up more than enough where I didn't quite possibly escape like a parentheses or brackets or any other tons of characters you normally have. So that was pretty cool. So look forward to that all week, which will be pretty cool. I'm trying to think what else. They're also running a whole series on how to install .NET Core and PowerShell and Linux using DSC, or just use, that in general. Definitely check that out if you're into that. I haven't got a chance. Has anyone got a chance to try playing with PowerShell on Linux yet?
It's weird.
It's weird?
Yeah, it broke my brain.
Oh, really?
Well, because I did Bash on Windows and then like PowerShell on Linux at the same time, and it broke my brain.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll definitely mess you up.
Yeah.
I haven't done either yet. Unfortunately, I haven't got around to it, but I'm kind of interested in giving it a whirl sometime soon. So were you able to, did you get it running at all, or did you get it running and you just have people
I
playing?
did get it running. I didn't try doing a remote session from like Linux into a Windows box. I believe you're supposed to be able to, but it only uses basic auth. You can't do it with anything else as of right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just doing like a simple get process and then like getting the members off of that, like digging through it. It was like, okay, this is just interpreting everything the way I would normally see it in Windows in a Linux context with the proper terminology and all. That was the brain breaking things. I'm like, oh, they can collect PS and it's kind of whatever, but it's how thorough it is. Even though I shouldn't be surprised, it was like they're releasing this as a thing. I was like, this is crazy. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no, they ain't even more encouraged. I could give it a whirl. I think it's all those other equipment specs. That's the only thing. There wasn't too much news-wise this week, unless anyone else noticed something around. But that's all I had. Anyone else have anything? Any problems, issues, or anything they want to discuss? All right. Well, yeah, that's it for this month. I forget who we have next. I think it's Dave Wilson. I was thinking actually Dave Wilson does. I remember he had a chat before his topic, but he will be on the November speaker. I know I'm still trying to work on a GitHub presentation because a bunch of stuff, especially in the Exchange realm, that I've been wanting to contribute to. Not sure how many people work with Exchange around here. Around here. So yeah, Paul Cunningham actually writes a Exchange analyzer tool that he's actually putting in GitHub and asking everybody to kind of contribute to it. Since I work heavily with Exchange at my job, I'm trying to sit down and actually use this as my reason to actually start using GitHub. I've thrown some of my stuff on there, but I've been horrible at actually doing any sort of source control. I know you've been working extensively. I'm not sure anyone else does it as well here. But I think I mentioned this before. Like I'm a one person in my department. I'm like the one person who does any scripting at all. So we have like zero source control in my department. Where like you guys, TJ last mentioned this. He has a team of people, so they're constantly throwing stuff in source control. So I'm trying to kind of force myself to get into it. And this was kind of my external project. I was going to force myself to actually start contributing to. So I'm hoping to get a presentation about this sooner than later. Hopefully in the year. And tack it on to one of our speakers soon. But yeah, I think that's it.
I forget, does the PowerShell IDE integrate with any source control?
So
because it's so easy for me to use source control because I'm a programmer more than a scripting person, so I use Visual Studio,
Mhm.
and it just automatically says, well, if I start typing in something, it says, oh, I'm going to check that out for you.
So-
It doesn't even ask me.
Yeah, so I know Visual Studio Code has tons of hooks for pretty much anything. I think if you're going to use the IDE, you just have to install like something. I think like the Git module. GitHub has the Git commands that you can just kind of just work into it. It's not going to be automatic. You got to kind of just do like Git pull and all the commands
But
from
if
it.
you do that, I mean, that's what helps you use source controls. If it's not, doesn't have to be an afterthought or something. It just
Yeah, and that's the thing. I need to get into it. During it was like 2 years ago. I think they had the team version of the scripting games. We used it a lot, and that was my first introduction to it. And just I haven't had any reason to do it since then, unfortunately. But it's like one of my big goals for this year. So yeah. Hey, how was you want to talk about how Ignite was? Because there was a really good, from understanding, really good presentation with Jeffrey Snover and Don about PowerShell 5 stuff.
About that, I was the cupcake girl.
Oh, really? Okay, well, I'll have to
I
definitely watch that then.
Go and give Jeffrey the cupcake for the 10th birthday of PowerShell. So, yeah, that was kind of crazy.
So how was it overall? How was it overall? Did you go last year?
I did not go last
Okay.
year, and I didn't hear great things about it going into it, so I didn't really have any high expectations of. They just kind of said it's all spread out, it's all over the place. Speakers are kind of picked based on, like, you submit your name and they tell you what you're going to talk about, kind of thing. So I wasn't really expecting much. A lot of it, I think, was, I'm going to say, like 200 level overview, or at least the general sessions that I attended were pretty much 200 level. A lot of promotion. Winnie and I were talking before we came in. A lot of promotion about the cloud and Azure Stack, which is still not out. And my favorite session, besides the Don and Jeffrey one, was the release pipeline. So, Michael Green and Mark Gray did the release pipeline with ESTS or TFS or whatever they call it now.
Team Foundation Server?
Yeah, it was just basically putting together a basic release pipeline and some things.
Cool. And all that stuff's available online too, so if anyone wants to
Yes.
see those, definitely check those out.
On YouTube right now.
They're all on YouTube.
Yeah, I think a few people have some downloader scripts. Maybe just Google or Bing it. I know one in particular I was looking for.
There's a link out there. I heard the eggs are green one day.
You know what? I didn't really eat. So first of all, I only ate bacon for breakfast. I didn't go anywhere near the eggs. And after the first day of lunch, I didn't go back for lunch at all.
Really?
Nope.
Wow.
The food was really
A piece
bad.
of cheese and a piece of ham. or
Piece of
like
cheese
that.
and a piece of turkey on a huge piece of bread. I was just like, after
Yeah.
the first day, I was like, no.
Yeah, it was like bread, one lettuce, one tomato, painted protein. That was pretty much the whole thing. It was pretty much.
Yeah, the big problem is it's like logistically, it's like hard to feed
sure.
that many people. Because I was the one in Chicago the previous year, and it was just like there was like lines and it was like.
They basically
So-
said it was the same food as Chicago
Really?
for lunch anyway. After the first day, I went to the food court across the street every day.
What was the attendance? 20,000?
23,000?
Pardon me?
I want to say 23,000 is what I heard.
Yeah, and it's hard to feed like 23,000 people.
Yeah.
Like I mean, you have like big conferences, but there's no like set lunch period. Like you always hear like for example, San Diego Comic-Con brings like 130,000 people in like that weekend, or they even daily, but nobody's going all at once to go to lunch. They all just like scatter out to the various places throughout the day. So it's kind of hard being that many people when they got a 2-hour span.
We're calling the lunch trucks for them.
Yeah, which you think they'd actually hook up with some lunch trucks, but whatever.
Well, the other thing that they were promoting at the Pluralsight booth was, so they were giving out these stickers, but they also had the cards. Jason Helmick, Jeffrey Snover, and one of the Pluralsight Linux guys did a 6-hour play-by-play video on PowerShell on Linux and Mac.
Over that while.
It is free if you're not a Pluralsight subscriber, so you can go and check it out. And
So yeah, hope then our
so
notes for this as well. Did you guys any of the after events with like the PowerShell group or any of the other like networking stuff?
I went
For
to the
me,
community happy hour. They did a user group meeting with the Atlanta user group, which was like Don and Jason and Jeffrey Hicks. Big surprise there. And the crew meet, I did Sunday night.
nice. Yeah, because that's one of the biggest benefits I got out of it last year, was just going, just networking, just talking to people.
Yeah, I mean
the events afterwards.
I probably did. If I did 3 sessions a day, that was a lot, and I just kind of like walked around and networked, and there you go.
Nice. Yeah, sort of this links. Awesome. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that info.
Sure.
It's nice to hear some, because my boss went, but he was mostly doing all the Azure and cloud stuff. So I didn't get a chance, and I think Lido got the chance to go, but it was like one of those things where they think they would pay his ticket but not pay for his travels. So he's just kind of like, it's not worth it, my time and effort to go there.
I wasn't really planning on going this year, but we use our education credits with our Microsoft partnership or whatever, and I got to go for free, so
Okay.
we just had to pay travel.
Sweet. Cool. So yeah, well, actually, we'll hopefully have all the stuff from Warren up on the website. Once I encode the video, I'll put links up to everything I talked about in the play-by-play as well, as long as the Ignite download sessions and a few other things we talked about. But yeah, that's it.
That one's 2015.
This one, oh, which one here? Oh, you're right, it is 2015. Never mind. There's one somewhere. I saw it somewhere.
There is one somewhere.
I'm pretty sure it's almost the same one, but look it up.